Hey guys, what up? Tony here. My heart, my vision, and my passion is to take God's message of purity to the world. The Power of Purity is a 501c3 nonprofit, and like any other ministry, the reach and impact of what we're able to accomplish through the power of purity is predicated upon the finances that we have available. In view of this, we need help. And it's only because of faithful ministry partners like you that the Power of Purity is touching lives literally all around the world. Would you consider making a donation or becoming a monthly partner with this ministry so we can continue to unleash massive amounts of destruction upon the kingdom of darkness? Every dollar you give is tax deductible, and every dollar will be used to advance the healing message of purity to a world that desperately needs it. If you've been touched and encouraged by the Power of Purity, and if you believe in the message of this ministry, would you prayerfully consider becoming a monthly partner? If so, you can visit the Power of Purity website at www.powerofpurity.org, and at the top of the page is a donations link where you can become a vital part of this ministry's impact. Thank you so much for your love, your prayer, and your partnership. God bless you.
Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. What up? I'm glad you're with me today as we continue this series of episodes that we've been involved with entitled Understanding Your Story. And I pray this series has been a blessing to you. I pray that it's helping you to understand yourself maybe better than you ever have before. And I pray that it's helping you move forward on the healing path that God has intended for your life. And I've shared with you guys that I have 16 principles for this series of episodes, and we've been working our way through these principles, and we have now finished the first 13 principles as of last week. So we're going to continue this week with principle 14. And just a couple observations I want to share. I touched on one last week, but if you review these principles, you'll see that principle 1 through 10 is kind of the bad news, kind of what went wrong in our lives and our stories. But then beginning in principle 11, we start the good news, the reality that God wants to do something about it. So principle 11 was God wants to bring His healing to the most hurtful and painful stories of our lives. Principle 12 is to experience God's healing in your sexual self will involve you entering a working cooperation with God. And principle 13, which we covered last time, is to experience God's healing in your heart and life will involve you letting God into the most hurtful and painful stories of your life. And that brings us to principle 14, where we're going to continue today. And I'm going to jump into this in just a moment, but before I do, I want to explain something to you guys, and that is that principle 1 through 13 I've been covering one at a time. Principle 1, then I talk about it. Principle 2, then I talk about it. Principle 3, I talk about it. And we've covered 13 principles. We now come to principle 14, and my point is, guys, that under principle 14, I have 12 points under principle 14. So the fact is we're going to be on principle 14 probably for a little bit here, maybe at least the next couple episodes. So principle 14 is going to be kind of extensive. So I just wanted to explain that to you. We've covered the first 13 principles. We're now going into principle 14, which will be on for a while. And then we're going to close this series of episodes, Understanding Your Story, with principle 15 and 16. But today we're starting principle 14, and principle 14 is this: 12 suggestions on letting God into your stories. And again, Principle 14, 12 suggestions on letting God into your stories. Now, as you know, our previous point, Principle 13, stated that in order to experience God's healing in our lives will require us to let God into the most hurtful and painful stories of our lives. Remember, God wanted to meet Mac at the shack? And God, I'm suggesting, wants to meet us at our own shack or shacks, the stories of our lives that cause us the most hurt and pain. Maybe the sexual stories of our lives that have been layered, that produced this trajectory that brought me from there to here to be this man today that I am, that's still struggling with managing my sexual self in a healthy way. So God wants to come into our stories. And that sounds pretty good, right? To let God into the most hurtful and painful stories of our lives. But what does it really mean? And how do I really do it? And is it really a practical thing to do? Or is it just a concept that sounds good in theory, but really isn't realistic in practice? Like the smoke illustration that I've given earlier in a podcast. If we were standing at a campfire and I asked you to bring me a handful of smoke, could you do it? Could you grab a handful of smoke and bring it over to me? And I'd suggest that it's probably going to be very difficult to do so, because even though the campfire's really real, and the smoke's really real, and your hand is really real, it would no doubt be profoundly difficult for you to grab a handful of smoke and bring it over to me. So in much the same way, when I suggest that you need to let God into the most hurtful and painful stories of your life, it's kind of like me asking you to grab a handful of smoke. I mean, for real, how does a person do this? What does it mean? What does it look like to let God into the most hurtful and painful stories of your life? And although I'm quite sure that much more could be said about this and how to do it, I want to share with you at least 12 principles that I've identified on how to let God into the most hurtful and painful stories of your life. So we're going to break this down where the rubber meets the road. We're going to try to make it as practical as we can to help you identify the path so that you can take this journey with God and you can journey with God into the stories of your life so that you can experience the deepest healing of God that you've ever experienced before. So I've got a total of 12 principles. Under Principle 14, these are 12 suggestions on letting God into your stories. And the first principle is this: you must identify the most painful and shameful stories of your life. The key word in this first principle is the word identify. You must identify the most painful and shameful stories of your life. Or said another way, before you can let God into the most painful and shameful stories of your life, you have to know what those stories are. You have to identify them. And by the way, this can be the value of the top 10 exercise that I've referenced several times in the past episodes. When a person reflects upon the course and landscape of their entire life toward the purpose of making a list, or maybe two lists. The first list is the 10 most hurtful and painful things that have ever happened to them in their life. The second list is the 10 most shameful things that a person has ever done in their life. Or we might say we're identifying 20 of the most significant, hurtful, painful, shameful stories of our life. And the value of this is that if we can do this, it's going to give us a pretty good idea of the places where God probably wants to meet us. We're identifying the primary shacks of our life. Just like for Mac, one of the main places of pain, the main place of pain in his heart and soul was the shack. So God said, that's where I want to meet you, at the shack. So as we identify these primary stories of our life, chances are pretty good That's pointing us in a direction probably of where God is going to want to meet us, where God is inviting us into this working cooperation with Him. So, principle 1, we have to identify the most painful and shameful stories of our life. And by the way, you guys, I just want to mention that when you make your top 10 list or list, there's nothing particularly significant about the number 10. I say the top 10, I guess almost modeled in a way after David Letterman's top 10, that he would always do. I just feel like 10 is a good round number. It's a good place to start. It's a good place to begin in identifying the most hurtful, painful, and shameful stories of your life. It certainly doesn't mean that you have to stop at 10 as you begin to identify what you think are the key stories of your life. In fact, when I gave this assignment to one man that I was counseling, he came back with a list of 23 stories from his life. And when I reviewed the list with him, you could not believe the stories of this guy's life. And I saw why he put 23 on there, because certainly every one of them deserved to be on this list. They represented the most painful, hurtful, shameful stories, unbelievable, horrendous stories of this man's life. Probably the key stories that he has business to do with God around these 23 stories. So it doesn't have to be 10. I set that as a goal, try to identify at least 10 to start. But if you're a little bit short or if you go way over, it doesn't matter. Just begin to identify the key stories of your life. And that's principle number 1. Principle number 2 is this: you must face the most painful and shameful stories of your life. Number 1, you identify them. Number 2, you must face them. So the operative word there is face. Number 1, identify. Number 2, face. And with this principle, I'm picturing the metaphor of a person facing away from something and then turning toward it, turning to face the very thing that they've been facing away from for so long. So, for example, imagine if you were standing in your kitchen with your back toward your refrigerator. You're facing away from the refrigerator. It's literally behind you. It's at your back, so you can't even see it. But then, what if I ask you to turn around and to face the refrigerator? Which means the refrigerator is now right in front of you. You're facing it, and now you can see it. That's what we're talking about here. Because a very sad but a very common reality is that what most people do with the most painful and shameful stories of their lives is that they turn away from them, and they face away from them, just like the refrigerator. And we've tried to deal with these painful and shameful stories of our life by not dealing with these stories. Or said another way, we ignore them, we pretend like these stories didn't really happen, or we minimize them, or we try to tell ourselves it doesn't really matter and it wasn't really that big of a deal, or we tell ourselves that those things happened a long time ago, so it doesn't matter anymore. And we essentially try to treat these stories from our life like the refrigerator, in the sense that if we face away from them and we don't look at them or acknowledge them, then maybe they didn't really happen. And if they did happen, then maybe if I ignore them long enough, they'll just go away. And the only problem I see with this strategy, you guys, is that it's kind of like being in a swimming pool and trying to hold a really big beach ball down underneath the water. Because you don't like the beach ball, you don't like what it represents, you don't like the memory, and you don't want the beach ball to exist. So you think, I'll just kind of ignore it. If I can push it down under the water and keep it there, then it'll be out of sight, out of mind, right? And I won't have to worry about it. And my only question would be this: how do you think that strategy is going to work out for you? Because the fact is, you might be able to hold a beach ball under the water for a little bit, but chances are you're not going to be able to hold it down very long, certainly not forever. And the reality is that the refrigerator really exists, and the beach ball really exists. And if you really want to be a healthier person, and you really want to experience God's healing in your heart and your life and your story, it's going to involve you not only identifying the most painful and shameful stories of your life, but you also truly must begin to face those stories, maybe for the first time in your life. And by the way, I freely admit that this is easier said than done, because in a very real way, what we're talking about here is very counterintuitive to most human beings, because the natural inclination for most people is to simply continue doing what they've always done, which is to go above and beyond the call of duty, to do everything and anything possible in order to deny or avoid or suppress or ignore or shun or escape or elude these very places and stories of our lives. But what we're coming to see now, and what we're coming to understand and comprehend with clarity, is that if we want to be a healthier person, and if we want to truly experience God's healing in our hearts and our lives, then we're going to have to not only begin to identify the most painful and shameful stories of our lives, but we're also going to have to face those stories. And that brings us to principle number 3, which is this: you must enter the most painful stories of your life. So number 1, the operative word is identify. Number 2 is face. Number 3 is enter. You must enter the most painful stories of your life. Mac had to go to the shack, you see. God was inside the shack. He had to enter the shack. He had to go in the shack with God. So we must enter the most painful stories of our life. And for this point, I'm picturing another metaphor, you guys. It's a metaphor of a museum. Like, imagine the St. Louis Art Museum, or the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, or the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., or the Louvre in Paris. And the point is this, you guys. When you go to a museum, you don't just identify the museum you want to visit, and then you don't just go to the visit and stand there and face it and look at the museum, but you actually have to enter the museum at some point, or actually go into the museum to see what's in there. And I'm suggesting here that this is exactly what we need to do with the most painful and shameful stories of our lives. We need to identify them, and then we need to face them, and then we need to enter them so we can see what's in there. And so I ask a question at this point, and the question is this: would you enter a museum like this if you were given the chance? Would you enter a museum if the purpose of the museum was to display and exhibit the most painful and shameful stories of your life? For example, for my wife, what if there was a museum for real, a literal physical museum, a literal physical location that Sherry could go and visit, and the name of the museum was the Museum of Sherry's Rape? So she could literally physically go into this museum and enter this museum, and the primary purpose and exhibit of this museum would be Sherry's rape, this historical event that happened to her when she was 13 years old. You know, like, you can go to these different museums that focus on different historical events that really happened. Like, you can go to a Holocaust museum, or Pearl Harbor, or the 9/11 Memorial in New York City. What if there was a similar museum that exhibited the historical reality of this thing that happened in Sherry's life, the Museum of Sherry's Rape? If there was, it would lead to a very interesting question, which is this: would Sherry be willing to enter that museum? Or in my own situation, what if I could go to a literal physical museum and the name of the museum, for example, was the Museum of Angelo's Anger, because my dad's anger is one of the items on my top 10 list. And my dad's anger and my corresponding response of fear and all the corresponding implications and nuances of my dad's anger and my fear and how all that played itself out in my life and my soul and my story has had profound implications and ramifications upon my life in many different ways. So wouldn't it be amazing and profound if I could really go back and somehow enter the museum of that one story of my life, the Museum of Angelo's Anger, and begin to really understand the implications of how my life was impacted and affected accordingly? Or what if you could go back and enter the museum of your own sexual abuse when you were 12 years old, or the museum of your parents' divorce when you were 9 years old, or the museum of your mother's death when you were 8 years old, or the museum of finding your father's pornography like I did when you were 10 years old, or the museum of any other significant event from your top 10 list. And with that being said, it brings us to our fourth principle underneath Principle 14. Let me remind you, Principle 14 of understanding your story is 12 suggestions on letting God into your stories. Number 1 is you must identify your most painful and shameful stories. Number 2 is you must face the most painful and shameful stories. Number 3, you must enter the most painful and shameful stories. Number 4, this is number 4, you must begin to explore the most painful and shameful stories of your life. So the operative word here is explore. Or said another way, in the metaphor of the museum, it's great when you finally get to the museum and you then enter the museum, but in reality, the very reason that you go to the museum and you enter the museum is so that you can explore the museum. Isn't that true? For example, as previously mentioned, if you went to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, or the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., or the Louvre in Paris, you could literally spend days in one of those museums exploring every nook and cranny, taking in all the displays and the different exhibits of that particular museum. Or said another way, you can literally walk around and look around and browse and investigate and explore for hours and hours, if not for days and days. So imagine, for example, the implications of Sherry visiting the Museum of Sherry's Rape. What if she could not only identify that museum and then go there and face the museum and enter the museum, but what if she could begin to walk around and look around and browse and investigate and explore what was in that museum? For example, you know how museums typically have various films that you can watch that are related to the topic and purpose of that particular museum. So like if you go to the Pearl Harbor Museum, they have a film, you go in, a 6-minute film, and you go in and it shows footage, actual footage of Pearl Harbor and the bombing and the ships and everything that happened. You can watch this film. What if Sherry could go into the Museum of Sherry's Rape, and one of the exhibits was a film that literally showed the rape? So Sherry could sit there and watch the film of her actual rape. So the 55-year-old Sherry could sit there and watch this event and see exactly what happened to the 13-year-old Sherry all those years ago when this story happened. And she could then see and she could then remember what she was actually wearing that day. She could see how long her hair was on that day, how her hair was fixed. She could see the glasses that she was wearing at that stage in her life. She could see what color the carpet was in the room. And then she could watch what this older guy said to her and what he did to her and how this thing unfolded and how it happened. And what if she could actually see the expression on this little girl's face when this thing was happening to her? What do you think watching this film would provoke in Sherry's heart? And then after watching the film, what if she could move on through the museum and see other associated displays and exhibits, such as an exhibit of the chronology of events that led up to her going into that house where she was raped? And then there's another exhibit that features the relationships that she had with each one of her friends at the time, who were also in the house at the time that she was taken into the bedroom to be raped. And then what if she could go on into another exhibit in the museum that would feature the thoughts and the emotions and the confusion this little 13-year-old girl felt and experienced both during and after the rape? So that as Sherry viewed this particular exhibit of the museum, she would maybe realize and think to herself, oh, wow, look at this little girl's innocence and naivete. She was so excited that this boy seemed interested in her. He was giving her attention because she wanted a boyfriend, just like the other girls who had boyfriends, and she thought they were going in the bedroom maybe to kiss and maybe make out, but she had no idea what was about to happen. She had no idea what was alive in his mind and heart and what he was intending to do. Because as he was taking her into the bedroom, what he wanted to happen and what he was going to make happen was completely and radically different than what she thought was going to happen. And then, what if there was another exhibit in the museum entitled, in big, bold, black letters, one word above this exhibit, S-H-A-M-E, shame. And in this exhibit, it explained how shame came into Sherry's soul when she was 13 years old, and how that shame began to embed itself deeply and profoundly on the inside of her, and how it began to affect the way she saw herself and the way she felt about herself, and how that shame began to grow, and how it began to become more and more powerful in her life and soul, and how it began to follow her through life for years and years to come. And then on it would go as Sherry would slowly work her way through this museum, display after display, the film, the displays, exhibit after exhibit, for the purpose of exploring all the different aspects and nuances of this one story from her life. So you see, in a very real way, the very purpose of going into a museum is to explore. So you can begin to discover everything that's in that particular museum. And that brings me to another observation about this concept of exploration, which is this: the concept that exploration implies the necessity of time. Or said another way, you don't do this fast. It's a kind of journey. It's a process. It's not an event, because it takes time to explore, right? It's a process that unfolds. You don't explore very quickly. And the way I might want to speak to this concept of exploration is in view of my own therapeutic process, because when I was in therapy, we would identify particular stories of my life that were stories of significance. And then, for real, we might spend weeks or even months discussing and exploring each one of these particular incidents. And if you heard my story, you'll remember that I was in therapy for 6.5 years. So that's what I was doing for these 6.5 years. We'd identify a story and sometimes literally spend months talking about this one event in my life. And in the way of example, there are 3 stories that immediately stand out to me. One was my relationship with my father and my fear of him. 2 was my relationship with my first pastor and the implications of his sexual affair with my first girlfriend when I was 16 years old, and how that affected me and what that taught me and how it influenced my sexual trajectory in life. And number 3, the 2 situations of sexual abuse that were perpetrated against me by older women when I was an adolescent. And what I'm basically telling you guys is that this was a big part of the work I did during my 6-year therapeutic process. We would identify some of these key stories from my life, and I then had the opportunity to face each particular story, and I would then enter that story just like I was entering a museum, and then I would spend many, many different counseling sessions for weeks and weeks, if not months and months, essentially exploring each of those significant stories from my life, as if I was walking around and looking around and browsing and investigating and exploring each of the most painful and shameful stories of my life. And guys, as I come to the conclusion of this 4th principle, which is you must explore the most painful and shameful stories of your life, do you know why I was taking my time exploring these stories? Because of the next principle, principle number 5, which if you want to know what it is, you're going to have to come back next week as we continue the Power of Purity podcast, because I see from the clock on the wall that my time has expired for this particular episode. So please come back and meet with me again next week, and we will continue with Principle 5, the 5th principle of the 12 suggestions on how to enter this working cooperation with God and how to let God into the stories of your life. God bless you guys. I'll look forward to seeing you next week, and have an awesome day.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.